I wanted to have a program on buying a business, who should buy a business, how would they find a business, how would they buy a business, and that's what we'll be touching on today, just because it happens to be one of my own favorite topics. Let me introduce the panelists briefly, and then I'll have them each share with you their stories. On the far right, I have Mathew Hanson of Emprise Partners, and I've known Mathew for probably 30 years. And then we have right here on my immediate right, Rudy Sangari of Pars Capital Partners. Rudy's a good friend. Jill Arena, second from the end. And then the only woman on our panel. We're not very gender balanced, sorry. And Jill is with Arena Enterprises. And then I've got Elias Ladon, who I've known from the OVA for at least 30 years, second in, and he's with Enterprise DR. Now let me start with Mathew by letting each of our panelists give you a brief synopsis of how they got here career-wise and what they do for business buyers.
Thank you, Ben. So Mathew Hanson, I have a background in accounting, I'm a Case graduate, worked at Price Waterhouse, one of the big 8 at that time, for 4 years in the tax department, including some time over in London, England, doing expatriate tax returns. Came back in the mid-'80s and worked with Prescott Ball and Turbin during the go-go days of the '80s with Mike Milken, legitimizing high-yield finance, and was fortunate to participate in some high-yield financings. And then in 1989, started my own business, working with lower middle market businesses, $5 to $25 million revenue range and transaction size. And over that period of time that I've been in business, I've actually represented over 50 buyers of companies successfully. And kind of to Ben's point, several of my clients have made millions of dollars. Hopefully I contributed a little bit to that process.
Okay, Jill.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jill Arena. I own a company in Cleveland called Arena Enterprises. I was called a buy-side intermediary. Years ago, as a kid, I worked for a company called Paychecks in Rochester, New York, where I'm from. They taught me how to sell, and they taught me how to sell and stay at the upper part of the stack ranking in the sales process. I got world-class training at Paychecks, Sandler training. And so years would go by. I would be a top producing salesperson for several companies. I was giving a presentation at a Vistage event on prospecting, and someone afterwards came up to me and said, "Your skills would be perfect for M&A." And when I said, "How so?" they said, "Well, an investment banker will put a company up for sale. Only one company will be the winner or the award the bid. You can go help the other acquisitive companies that were trying to buy that company. Just go help them. They're acquisitive. They're looking to grow through acquisition or buy a company." And so within a short period of time from that conversation, I connected with an investment banker. They were sell side. I became the buy side for them. A wonderful man, Bill Everts Capital. And from there, I did my first project in plastics. We helped a plastic injection molder find a company that could work with DuPont's product called Serlin. So I was hooked. I love the granular, really minute details of a search. So I guess if you look at what I do, it's basically like a recruiter. We take on buy-side searches for private equity groups looking for a platform or an add-on. We help strategic buyers find companies to acquire, and we help individual buyers. My favorite group is the individual buyers. But I have to tell you, we're focused on manufacturing, distribution, and business services. And I can go on, but I won't. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you for being here, everyone.
Good morning. This is Elias Ladon. I am a buy-side. I represent buyers and sellers, primarily sellers. And I started my career in kind of a serendipitous way. I emigrated from Greece and with the intention of becoming a PhD in chemistry. I went through the program at Michigan State University, got fully qualified for a PhD except for thesis, and then I decided to go to New York University to get an MBA to go after the business world. Worked for a couple of three big companies. The last one was British Petroleum in New York City. Then that brought me to Cleveland for 3 years. That became a lifetime. And the last job I had was, all the jobs at BP were kind of M&A related. And then I was downsized and decided to buy into a specialty chemical firm because of my financial management skills, which was a turnaround situation, turn it around, and then sold it, and then decided to help somebody from Florida to acquire a company and become partners with him, but then he decided to keep it for himself and he didn't want a partner. So I ended up becoming an intermediary, which is the path for many people follow after they go through the business world. And so here I am for about the last 30 years having fun. In the process met several great people like Ben Calkins. We used to serve in the panel, the panel of the OVA, right?
Right.
For a couple of years.
The board of the OVA.
Right, the
yeah.
board of the OVA. And here I am.
Okay, Rudy?
Good morning. Thanks for coming. Rudy Sangari. Jill just sent me for a loop with that Sandler comment. That goes back a few years.
I'm old.
Yeah, business background. I started with electronic data system, Ross Pro's company. And fast forward, I ended up at Siemens. Spent about 12 years at Siemens as a corporate development. I was just talking to, I think, John and somebody else. Siemens is a small company, 500,000 people, back in 2007. So Siemens had a division that captures ideas before they come to the street for the merger purposes. So we grabbed the technology before it hit the street. From Siemens, I moved into Morgan Stanley on the banking side. Did tour of duty at Morgan Stanley and one at Merrill Lynch. In 2014, I semi-retired from banking, and it lasted about 6 months. Ended up with a small bank in Minnesota, broker banker securities, and we did cap raise, M&A, and primarily on the biotech side. And in 2021, launched Pars Capital. We do typical banking stuff, mergers, acquisitions, and cap raise. I have a focus in life sciences, and I don't have any clients locally. Ben and I have worked on a few transactions in my space, and I think I'll make a stop there.
Okay. Now, if anyone, as we get into the program, has questions, by all means, raise your hand. Why don't we start with, we'll start with Jill. And why don't we talk first about who should think about buying a business, and then what should they think about?
Sure.
And we'll let Jill start, and then we'll pass it around from there.
I think anyone can buy a business, and everyone should take a look at it. Entrepreneurship, there's no ceiling on your income. It's a lot of hard work, but it's an amazing feeling. When I talk to a lot of individual buyers, and they ask me that same thing, what do I need? So you need some basics. You need to open up a limited liability corporation. Your holding company is the one that's going to buy the company, not you. You need to get your thesis in order. You have to talk about yourself in writing, maybe at one tear sheet, to tell the world who you are, what you did, and why you want to buy a company. I love people who come to me with like almost a bio with their picture, and because what we have to do is now sell them to the seller. You have to sell that person. And I like people who come with real passion. So the 4 things I talk about with my clients are, you're going to have to focus on numbers, passion, discipline, and faith. And I'll take you through that very quickly, but I can speak on this forever. The numbers. The numbers related to the business. Is the business cash flowing? Does it have a strong core team that will stay? You really have to look at the numbers and how many clients, is there customer concentration? There's a lot of numbers involved in buying a business. You have to understand the language of business, which is the accounting of the business. Then passion. You have to be passionate about your topic or your field you want to go into. You have to have real discipline when it comes to the search, and you have to have faith in the process and faith in the people that you are going to be working with that work for the company you just acquired. So, you have to get organized, and there's a real art and a science to it. And I would say the numbers and the discipline are more of the science, and the faith and the passion are more of the art. I can go on and on. We've helped a lot of companies. Let's talk about individual buyers for a minute. When the individual buyers come to us, and I can tell you a million stories. I had a yacht builder who ended up buying a math book company. I had an United States Marine buy 3 shelf-stable food brands. I had an electrical engineer from Pepperdine. He ended up buying a custom wheelchair company. There is no rhyme or reason sometimes. Sometimes I have a plastics expert who buys an injection molder or an extruder. But when the buyer and the seller sit next to each other and they come to the table and the buyer and the seller really like each other, they're going to move a mountain to get the deal done. And you can stray off your path, but you really have to have passion about being an entrepreneur. And that's kind of where I'll end.
Okay, let me turn it over to Mathew. And I think that when you talk about numbers, Jill, it also seems it's a little bit of a numbers game once you get into the process, because a lot of things that you might think are for sale aren't for sale, or they might not fit, or whatever the case may be. Maybe you can't put the deal together. So, numbers is obviously...
Well, that's another thing, and I'll turn over to Matt. Sometimes you look at one, and it's one and done, and sometimes one of my clients, we look for a year.
Yeah. Mathew, who would you, if someone came to you to talk about buying a business, what would you ask them, like, this type of question? Are you prepared for this? Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared for the other? This type of thing. What would you say? Just sort of, smoke them out, realizing that some prospective buyers are really tire kickers, and they will never buy. That's my experience. So what would you be looking for, Matthew?
You attorneys, you're always worried about the details of these discussions. I'm going to go back with Jill's orientation of there's a passion. So every one of you that want to buy a business have an inherent interest in doing that. It's an extremely exciting time. It's a new experience. It's fascinating because you've heard the stories about many people that have bought businesses successfully and been gratified both with what they did for customers and employees, but also received the financial benefits. My observation, not to dampen the enthusiasm, is to alert you a little bit about how competitive the world is today. And therefore, Jill's characterization of credibility and understanding of the competitive marketplace makes you a better buyer. So I think you're selling yourself as you go through this process and understanding who you are, what your skill sets are, what your knowledge base is, what your capabilities are. Inherently. The idea of putting together a profile and putting that out there is an important step in the process, because ultimately this discussion, respectful of the numbers and the provisions of a contract, ultimately this is a relationship business. So this is a little like dating. And when you're there, you want to have your best foot forward. You want people to know you're interested in buying a business that is $5 million in sales volume, pick your number. It's producing X amount of profitability. It does this product or service. It's within this geography. It has attributes that you bring to the table that would make you a credible buyer under those circumstances, knowledge, experience, contacts. And therefore, and you have X amount of money that's available for that purchase. So not dissimilar that from you going out and purchasing your first home, and you got pre-qualified on a loan, you would know you want a 4-bedroom house, you want, a swimming pool, you want it to be in a nice neighborhood with a good school system. Those are the criteria that I believe you should be articulating. And knowing how much you would like to spend for that business, it's $500,000, it's $5 million, whatever that is, and that you're able to have the resources, both your own personal capital, friends and neighbors, or institutional money that you could bring to the table, and relationships with people like Joe, bankers, who you can then credibly look at opportunities with on a combined basis.
Okay, Elias, do you want to jump in? Who do you think
Sure.
should own a business? You own a business yourself, but you built it, or you didn't buy it?
No, I bought it.
Oh, you bought it,
Yeah,
okay.
I bought it. Well, Jill and Mathew have put the framework very nicely, and maybe a way to contribute something is mention some examples of how I found buyers out of the people who came to me looking for a business. And it's kind of one of the things that I always ask is, tell me a little bit about what you like to do in life in general. What are your hobbies? What are your skill sets that doesn't necessarily relate to what you have done in your career? And that has become a good source of bringing opportunities to life that became relevant in their decision making. And of course, other things being equal and being, careful about understanding the economics, the numbers and all that stuff, that's important. But the inner drive, like Jill and Matt said, is an important parameter. And a couple of examples I would like to mention is there was a young fellow at the time who came to me. He said, I'm a graduate from Case Western Reserve and I studied aerospace engineering. In the process, I asked him, okay, tell me a little bit about your life. What's happening? And he said, well, I'm engaged with such and such, and what is she doing? She's in daycare. And I said, okay, well, I have a childcare business for sale, and now 20 years later, they have 3 childcare centers. The wife is the founder of all this, but he went along, and they have 2 children now. They're in the 20s. One is in college. And I asked them, are you guys ready to sell? No, we are having fun. It's not time to sell yet. So that's a good story. Another situation was I was doing an auction in a situation where there was somebody who was retrofitting golf carts into looking like a Cadillac or some other kind of stuff, and they built that business. The father was in plastics, and they built that business for their son who was invalid, and he died in his early 20s because of kidney failure. And they said, hey, we got to sell that. Linda, his wife, cannot take this. She cannot be in that business. So we did an auction, and there was one buyer who came who wanted to buy the business for his 15-year-old son. So he was railroading his 15-year-old to become an entrepreneur, because the guy was like to be tinkering with mechanics and all that. So he felt that would be a great opportunity. Well, what now? 12 years later, they have a successful business, and they continue that, and they do other things too. So that's another story. And I won't bother you with too many stories, but one other thing that is currently happening is I have a hair transplant business, And this fellow, who has a sales background, he's selling electric and other utility supply arrangements to companies. He came to me, he said, I'm interested in this business. I said, why would you be interested in this business? He said, I like to build organizations, build sales teams and all that, and I think this is something that is pertinent to me. He said, guess what? That's why the current owner of this business started. He was selling recreational vehicles. He had problems with his hair, and he bought the business that he was getting his hair taken care of. So that's another story that is kind of pertinent in how things happen and the way Jill and Matt described.
Yeah. All right, that's good. Rudy, what are your thoughts generally about who, you worked at Siemens, and, there are lots of companies that can provide you with security and, endless opportunities, keep you busy, check every Friday, benefits, et cetera, et cetera. And so what individual should even, we have a lot of people in this audience that have acknowledged that they have interest in buying a business. And, for who is that the best idea? What kind of a person, and bringing what to the table?
Thanks. I'm really trying to focus on your question, but I can't get, over the last comments you made about the hair transplant business. I think that was for me. That's a business I should have. I missed my opportunity.
Damn.
So I don't think I heard anybody in our audience that's an institutional investor, private equity, correct? Nobody is here, right? So everybody is individual, and there was a lot of good stuff that the panel kicked in. And your question, Ben, who should be thinking about buying a business? Anybody can buy a business, right? Anybody can be thinking about buying a business. I think I'm going to come at this from that search time, that before we get into the arts and science of making a deal. There's really an art and science of finding the business. So I don't think I've ever done a transaction with an individual that wanted to, just buy a business. Maybe some serial entrepreneurs I've had some experience with, but they have a pretty good process of understanding what they want to do. I think that the individuals, from what I've seen, they spend a lot of time, I'm not going to call it waste of time, but a lot of time in that search time. And they're not really, so some of the things that's really obvious is that they're not sure what they're looking for. They think they know what they want, but, when they go to execute a search, it really doesn't amount to a good thesis. Jill called it a thesis. Private equity people or VC people have this thing called the thesis. They know what they want, they know what it looks like before even finding it. They know how the numbers need to stack up. They have worked all that out before they go out and look for this thing. So they have that image of what they want, and there is some tolerance. 10% different on this side, on that side may be correct. So I would say, define your search pretty, well up front, unless you are completely open, unless you are, that you don't care if it's a injection molding or a hair transplant place. You're just looking to invest. Define your search, make sure you understand your search, and then get, it might sound like a plug, but really get, if you're serious about executing, get an advisor. It will cut down the time of your search, especially on the search part, because there are things that you really got to understand how to go about even approaching a business that may not be up for sale. So there are some businesses that are up for sale, and you can, You'll become part of the, whatever it is, auction or private auction or what have you. But there are businesses that are not for sale, or they're not advertised to be for sale. And somebody who understands what you're looking for can really help you. And like Mathew said, our business, a lot of people think is about numbers, and numbers are important, but numbers are also different for each sector, for each type of industry. A number for something defensive is not the same number for a growth company. Somebody mentioned they do business with growth companies. Those are all different numbers, different models. That art part of it, looking for the right business is really critical. And by the time you learn how to identify that, it's been it takes a few years to get there.
Can
Okay.
I
Yeah.
dovetail off that
Yeah,
one
go
for a
ahead,
second?
Jill.
We make the sheer volume of phone calls we make into calling owners. It's tremendous. And you wouldn't believe how many don't know how to exit. So what I'm saying is if you're an individual looking to acquire a company, or if you're strategic, there's strategic Lubersal's here, and when you make that call with honesty and integrity to say, hi, I'd like to acquire your company, or I'm looking for a company to acquire, you're of interest to me, you're gonna get honesty and integrity back. So what we hear often is the real story back. Jill, my kids don't want the business, you called at the right time, I woke up one day, I'm 70, I don't know how to exit. Jill, I'm on dialysis, or Jill, I'm divorcing. We hear everything. So we're calling with a buyer. I'm calling on behalf of Joe Smith or Eaton, so we're calling with honesty, they're giving us honesty back. And when the comment was made that a minute ago about approaching a seller or knowing what you want, half the battle is just getting to the table with the seller. So I don't want to drive business away from what we do, but if you wanted a company and you picked up the phone and called the owner and you had a reason for wanting that company, a strategic, maybe it gets you into a geography you're not in or helps you stop outsourcing something you're outsourcing, or an individual, you're passionate about packaging or plastics or industrial coatings or something. The ears of the seller will perk up when they see that you've made the effort. It's so simple, and it's a small thing, but it's amazing how the response we get. They get up, they close their door, and they start to tell us the truth. I don't know how to sell this thing. My kids are graduating from college. So it's fascinating what's sitting out there, but you have to have the courage to get to the table, and I think it's eye-opening.
So I can just supplement that a little bit. This idea of the criteria, knowing what you want, and being authentic through this process is extremely important, because this is a numbers game. And if you know what you're trying to buy, then you can be disciplined in saying no quickly, and therefore you're able to better utilize your time and get to that right conclusion. The one big risk that I see many people dealing with is we're in the Midwest, people are generally supportive and they're generally open to conversations with you, and many times these sellers have not decided, selling, not selling, right? And so they're able to carry on a long conversation with you, which monopolizes your time, so you're busy, but you may not necessarily be productive. And so utilizing the criteria will allow you to make your own personal decisions on a disciplined basis much more quickly. And then I wanted to embellish a little bit more. Rudy talked about having an intermediary as a part of the team, and I think that's helpful. But I think it is a team sport. So a really good attorney, which has experience in buying and selling businesses, an accountant who has experience, a banker or multiple bankers, are all part of your team, and you should start working together and pull those people together so that when you have opportunities, as Jill suggested, that you're able to say, hey, what about this, what about that? And it allows you to cut to the chase much more quickly.
Right.
Yeah, that's very good. Now, I had an observation, and that is that, I noticed that small, medium-sized, I guess we call them small, we're talking about the lower middle market of privately held businesses. I think that the market for those companies is very imperfect, and that creates the opportunity. Now, I work with Nancy Leisman on my investments, let's say, and she works with, publicly traded companies and securities, and there's information on them, and you can apply this and you can apply that and do it this way. Now, if I want to buy a home, let's say I want a home in Chautauqua or on Lake Chautauqua, I can, with the magic of the internet, I can call them all up. I can look at all the homes that are presently available on Lake Chautauqua. Now, that doesn't mean that I can look at the one that's not for sale yet, but I can look at the ones that are for sale. And then when it comes to finding a privately held company to buy, the best one to buy is the one that's not for sale. And so it's a discovery process. Now, I've noticed that many of the buyers for these companies, and in my own experience, 40 years, many of them are people with some money, because you'd have to be a really good bootstrapper to buy a company with no money, because the seller is going to want something. So they're typically people with a little money that find themselves not at home in corporate life, not happy at Siemens or the Cleveland Clinic or Key Bank, whatever. So they're usually people with an independent spirit, and sometimes the spirit is so independent that they're between opportunities. And, they're without a job. And then many of them decide they can find this company themselves. Now, that most of them have no idea what they're looking for. They've never bought a company before, and yet they think somehow by networking their way through a group like this, and it has happened, they might learn. I've shown people companies that they've bought and made a fortune. I've known of the company and I've shown it to them. So I find that many people, that's what they're inclined to do. Now, everyone on my panel today is an intermediary. Some, like Elias, works, he said, more often on the sell side. And so I would like each of them to talk to, how they would go about helping a buyer, if they would, and then talk about, although Mathew's already touched on it, what can having Jill in your corner do for you that just stumbling around at the Rotary Club, as an example, or at yours truly in Chagrin Falls, or Chuck's Beverage would be another good venue, won't do. What are you going to do for them? Let's start with you, Jill, and then we'll work through the crowd.
Well, seller's going to sell three ways, in my opinion. The seller is going to put themselves up for sale somehow publicly, like biz, buy, sell, or through an investment banker. They don't always have to say their name. Sometimes it's blind, but they're going to put themselves up for sale. The second way a seller is going to sell is bump into an intermediary who has a buyer, and our buyer buys the seller. The third thing is they're going to sell it to their employees or an employee, or they know who they want to sell it to. They call up their competitor and say, Joe, I'm selling to you. Or finally, maybe they turn it into an ESOP. So how we help is evangelizing the buyer to the sellers that aren't on the market. That is my entire thesis. I bank on that call I make is the perfect call for my buyer, because my buyer and I sat down and we used the NAICS codes or the SIC codes. We used Hoover's, which is Dun & Bradstreet, or Capital IQ, Standards & Poor, or Zoom Info. I can get every cell phone and Gmail for everyone in this room off of Zoom Info. So we sit down, we come up with a thesis, we look at geographic areas, the type of business, and then we make calls. And so that's how someone can work with an intermediary. Periodically, we're on the sell side. If I show a bunch of people, if I show one person a company and they don't buy it, then I know that seller's on the market because my buyer just took a pass. And that's a cast-off that I can then introduce to another buyer, potentially getting paid on the sell side. That's how you work with me. 3 things have to happen for a deal to take place. Buyer and seller have to have rapport. We all have to agree on valuation, which is purchase price, and then we have to agree on deal structure. How much cash at close? Will the seller hold a note? Will the seller stay on as a consultant? Is there, financing component? It's a deal structure, so it's rapport, valuation, and purchase price, and deal structure. We don't get past rapport to talking about valuation if there's no rapport. We don't get to the next level. So, and then I hope somebody starts to talk about multiples and what a company trades for. So, but
Okay, Matthew, you jump in now if you would, and let's talk about this too. You know, I'm at the clinic, I'm a successful oncologist, but I have a desire to own my own business. And I'm making a lot of money, and so I kind of like that. Every Friday there's a check for me right now, but I envision a different future for myself. Now, I go to Mathew and I say, I'm interested in buying a business, and this is what I'm inclined to buy. How do you sign them up, Mathew? Do you take any money from them? Do you just work off of their good looks? How do you get paid? How do you make a business of it? And once you start working with someone, you know, what's the relationship? Are they going to work with you and also Jill and also Rudy, or is it going to be you? How's this work?
Well, I told you, I think this is like romance, so the good looks are certainly important. But the ability to pay is as well. Most of my practice has been working with corporate buyers. I would characterize myself as being almost an outsourced corporate development department. So Eaton Corporation has a number of people internally that help understand and scour the marketplace. However, if you're a smaller business, privately held, somewhere between 50 and 250 million, you frequently have an interest in buying a company, but you don't have those internal resources. So those have been my clients where I work with them, helping them to make strategic acquisitions. In my practice, since they're corporate buyers, I'm able to charge them a monthly retainer. And typically my engagement would be 6 months long with a monthly retainer, and then I would net my retainer against the success fee on the successful transaction.
Okay, and you would be, if I was Eaton Corporation, I might have my own development people, but if I'm a smaller company, I would hire you, and then you'd handle it,
Right.
working with whoever I had on my staff.
Yep.
Okay.
My view is that I become a part of the management team, close enough to understand what you're doing, close enough to push back when I disagree with your assessment of the acquisition criteria. I look at it independently, I offer my suggestions, we come to terms with what those criteria are, and then, as Jill has discussed, I go into the marketplace, often trying to get people that are not officially for sale. It's a competitive advantage, and it allows us to play in a stronger way without some of this interference of competition.
Okay. Now, Elias, and let me invite all of you in the audience to bring questions if you have them. Just put your hand up, and we'll speak directly to your question. But Elias, you said you work a lot on the sell side. So what do you do with the buyer? Would you work with the buyer on the search? Or do you put the buyer on your list and then show them the opportunities that you have signed up on the sell side? How do you do it?
Well, depending on what I sense about the seriousness of the buyer, the capabilities, the sophistication, and all that stuff. And sometimes the deals can happen in a way that is unexpected. And I'll mention an example in the oil business. There was a buyer that came to me through an intermediary for a logistics oil-related business that I had for sale, and the buyer was kind of a very entrepreneurial guy in the trucking business, and with some IP background, believe it or not. And we had a logistics company in the Southwest and he met the seller. They kind of struck it together, and then the buyer decided that he wanted to significantly increase the price of the business, which typically would have blown the deal away. But the buyer had enough sophistication in terms of working with equity groups from past work, and he found an equity group that was specializing in the oil business. And these people understood the dynamics of that company, what was happening in that oil segment in the Southwest, and they could rationalize the price that the buyer wanted. And believe it or not, it happened. And it was like a significant, about 70–80% increase in the price of the asking price overnight. And so the numbers are important, as Matt was saying, but at the same time there was sophistication on the buy side to understand that that was really warranted
Right.
price increase. So.
Now, Rudy, wait, do I have a question? No. Rudy, what's your approach? I take it you work oftentimes with corporate clients as well.
Yeah.
And if you're gonna do a search, how do you do that with them?
Yeah. So my clients kind of, they divide into two groups. What we call strategic, meaning it's a company that wants to acquire, and then what we call financials, they are guys and gals who are private equities. And I have a little bit of a different model for each one of them. So on the corporate side, we're retainer based. So we get not a small retainer. And we get a retainer based on what they want to accomplish and how sophisticated it is. There are tools that we use for that. I just chalked down 4 tools that we use that gives us the private companies don't publish the information, obviously. There are things like revenue, EBITDA, and things like that. But we can get to that information. There is a lot of that available. And, I wrote down Capital IQ, Mergers, Acquisition, Axial, and Crunchbase. Those are our subscription services. And between those 6, our cost is about $150,000 a year for subscription to get to that data. So corporate understands that, that there are overhead and costs, and we work with them with the retainer model and based on, we structure a deal. Financial guys are a little bit different. They don't like to pay retainer, and we understand that unless they want an exclusivity. So when we are going out and buying something, we either can market that asset to multiple buyers, or we are going to work exclusively with one buyer. And the price, our fees are structured based on what they want to do.
Okay.
Do they want other people to present at the party to bid on it, or do they want to exclusively date this seller themselves? So that's a high level, and then
Okay.
we break it.
Okay,
Would
Nancy.
you guys talk about the competitive environment right now with private equity and what has changed post-pandemic and what you see kind of going forward?
Okay, any of you want to speak to that?
I'll take it.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So after post-pandemic, right now, we are in a little bit of a different transition that is separate from the pandemic. So after pandemic, there is a lot of liquidity for different types of assets from the institutional side. I'm just going to talk about the institutional side. Right now, the dynamic that we see, that there is not a lot of capital for large deals. Now, large deals we call, anything above $2 billion is a large deal. In the micro and small and even to medium small, which goes up to, micro starts at about 25 million, and, goes up from there. Lot of liquidity, lot of institutional capital flow is going into that market.
Is that just
Okay.
because valuations are, the multiples are less? Or is it just the
Mul-
volume of people that want to sell because of,
Multiples are a function of industry. So, in a high tech, in a tech versus, discrete manufacturing, multiples are different. So multiples are in the life sciences, in that subsector that we're in, multiples are very healthy, we model it based on size of the deal. So multiple for a $25 million company versus $250 million in the same sector are different. They have different constraints. So they can go anywhere from 9 of EBITDA to about 18 of EBITDA, depending on the mass that's coming to the deal.
Multiples are also variable based on the health of the company that I have found. So if there's a company that has strong year-over-year growth and a trend of growth, and if they have no customer concentration, they have a core team that'll stay, they have an automated infrastructure, there's a technology running the infrastructure, there's like 10 things that'll help a company command a higher EBITDA, or higher multiple of EBITDA. But he's right. I did a project in travel nurse staffing, and it was significantly higher than the same deal I did in commercial staffing. And there are just some industries or industry sectors that command IT, for instance, IT, MSP, MSSP, or cyber. On a couple deals I've done, they've commanded higher multiple of EBITDA than, a manufacturing company. So, but the health of the company's gotta be there.
It is
And
interesting
maybe-
to talk about multiples, though, because I had a deal earlier in the year, and a gentleman who I had helped buy an earlier business, one or two earlier businesses, he found a business, it wasn't for sale, he found it, and the gentleman that owned it was the son of the gentleman who had built it, and he wanted to sell two businesses for less than the appraised value of the real estate. Two, functioning, living, breathing businesses. And so, you don't really have a competitive market. Nobody's looking at multiples. I sold a winery this year, and there was an intermediary, and really he only found one buyer. Now, the buyer did give what the seller kind of had in mind, but there was no frenzy or anything of the sort, no analysis of the multiple of that kind of a winery.
Let me make a comment on the multiples based on what Jill said. When we build a model to what we think that, multiple is, and the multiples are pretty clear, in the institutional realm. And then we kind of measure the asset against the multiple, and then we either discount it or we put a premium on it. And that's what Jill is saying, that if the company is healthier, if the company has got good dynamics, then that company is going to go from the baseline to a premium. But if the company has got issues, or, they're not just company issues, personnel issues, all kinds of different things, then we discount it. But the multiple is pretty established, and, it's a very narrow, it's well defined, and then we discount it or we put a premium on the asset.
And there's only one variable that changes the multiple in my world quickly, is how bad the buyer wants it or needs it. That's the only thing, right? I've seen people or companies
Yeah.
buy. and
The emotional one.
Yeah.
They want it or need it to fulfill a big client project, or want it because this is the type of company they always dreamed of owning.
Yeah. Oh, they're fell in love.
Yeah, right, or buyers, yeah, right, so they'll pay a
They're
little bit more,
smitten.
and they, right.
Yes.
Seller
All right, let me try this now, because we're going to be running out of time, and I'll encourage our panelists to stick around afterwards if any of you have questions. I want to go down the road. We'll start with Rudy, and I ask you for two things. First, tell about the extent to which you get involved in financing an acquisition, assuming there is an acquisition. Do you do that always, sometimes, never, et cetera? And then talk about what you think generally about, for the person who does want to buy a privately held, smaller micro business. What do you think about the opportunity at this time for such a person? And we'll start with Rudy and then go down the row.
Well, as far as available capital for the small, micro, whatever that you want to do, make sure that's lined up before you go out for the search. Work with somebody, work with your banker, either commercial banker or private banker, whoever, or if it's your own wealth, make sure you've got that lined up, because that can become critical, obviously. And the first part of your question was?
No, that's the first part, the financing. And then the second part is, what do you think about now for a time to go and buy a business? Today.
I don't think it's a bad time. You have, depending on what you want to do, you have leverage, because when markets are, when there is not enough, if you are working somewhere where the private equity and VC are not bringing capital flow into it, then you have leverage, because, people who want to exit need your capital. And, if the way the economy is right now is not a bad time to buy. It's a very good time to buy, because we hear, all kinds of softness that may be out there, and so it's a buyer's market.
Okay. Elias?
Well, as far as availability of capital for micro deals, if I may use Rudy's expression, one source is obviously the Small Business Administration. Currently, there is a little bit of a turbulence in that area in terms of understanding what the new rules that they came up with. I listened to a seminar with 3 SBA intermediary bankers, and the word was that really a lot of things were said that sounded very encouraging as far as the SBA becoming a little bit more flexible with their allowances and the way they look at things, but they said until these are defined, you're better off talking to an established banker of your choice and go along with their guidance, because at the end of the day, what is that they feel comfortable in terms of doing, the financing is going to guide as opposed to what the SBA said.
I think it's a good time to buy a business. I don't, remember Sandler I told you about? Well, Tom Golisano, owner of Paychex, used to say, your business isn't good or bad out there in the environment, it's good or bad in your head. And so what I mean by that is, I interview a lot of sellers who tell me they started their company shortly after September 11th, and then shortly after 2008. So those are the worst times, it seems to, but so I would say now is a goodest time as any. And then I would say line up your banks. We've got a great banker here. Line up your banks, line up your fraternity brothers or your friends. I had a deal that needed $6 more million, and they passed the hat to get it amongst the fraternity brothers. And I would say, well, then you've got partners, right? If you're getting money like that, you've got partners, or you could work with the seller to have them hold a note. But I was on a turnout call recently between the SBA banker and a potential buyer, and that money was expensive. It's expensive right now. I want to reach out.
Prime is 8.5.
8.
If you're
So-
doing an SBA deal, sorry, just to
Yeah.
interrupt really
Yeah.
quick.
Please.
1.5 to 2% above prime.
That's right.
So people haven't actually digested this and seen it in those real terms.
Right. So
An SBA financed acquisition is gonna be 10.5%,
Yeah.
that's your senior rate.
That guy, the buyer, my client, hung up the phone. He's like, damn, I'm not borrowing at 10%. And he called his fraternity brother. I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
And so now he's got a partner in on this if it closes. So it's expensive right now. It'll come down, but
Okay, Matthew, you want
It's
to
a
wrap it
great,
up?
it's a great time to buy a business. Because there are always those opportunities that are not on the radar screen that Jill referenced, that you each have an opportunity to penetrate. And you have different skill sets that can make whatever business you're attempting to buy better. So I had a client, privately held company here in the Cleveland area, that was interested in making a strategic acquisition. And a week before we were to close on that acquisition, the entire sales force walked out. The entrepreneur's son and friends thought that they were going to be the buyers of the business. That became apparent that wasn't happening. They exited stage left. This particular client had a sales and marketing orientation. They closed the acquisition. I was surprised. He lived in that city for 6 months, reconstituted the sales force. And in subsequent conversations that I had with the chief financial officer of the business, he told me that their return on their equity on that investment was infinity. Disastrous situation, solved with a buyer's initiative and fortitude, created a wonderful acquisition opportunity. I think, Nancy, to your point about the marketplace in general, we've gone through some stutter steps with COVID. Rising interest rates are a delay. PPP money going through the system have caused problems, have caused people who are owners of business not to take those companies to marketplace. However, there's a thing called a silver tsunami that's taking place. People have looked at the numbers and said over the next 5, 10, 15 years, there are trillions of dollars of value in businesses that will be taken to the marketplace. However, I want to caution you on the amount of competition. So you have to bring your A game when you go through this process. When I started in my business, Riverside, large private equity firm headquartered in Cleveland, had $10 million with an M. The last I'd heard, it was $13 billion with a B. That's just the capital that came into their system with one firm. Private equity industry has gathered lots of value in that category. But as importantly, they have created an enormous amount of highly intellectual, highly motivated people through this system. And we're starting to see fragmentation of those people now splitting out of the larger firms and forming smaller firms or going out and buying businesses entrepreneurially, just as you might. So recognizing that that's the case, you have to bring your A game. Opportunities are there. Jill proves it every day that she can generate opportunities and we can find successful sellers and put them together with successful buyers. It's just a highly competitive marketplace, so be prepared.
It is, Matthew. It's amazing. Some of these private equity funds that used to be all with millions, now they are on their fund 4, fund 5 of billions, and they're oversubscribed. It is mind-boggling how much capital out there they are accumulating and going after assets. It is amazing.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. In November, on the third Friday, we're going to have our next meeting, and it will feature, interesting, last year we had John DeJulius at this time, and I needed better help with my web presence, and I learned who John's helper was. He said all his business was incoming. Matthew asked him if he wanted a referral to Goodyear or something. He said, no. He said, all my business comes to me. I'm on the internet, people call me. I thought, then I probably need his web help. So I got his web help, and his web help will be presenting in November. And I thank you all for coming. Let's have a round of applause for our. Okay. That's it.
We're adjourned.
We're adjourned, yes.
Good discussion.